Today, we continue our appreciation for the bad and the ugly. I bring you the top 20 worst comic books of all time. Coming at ya! Hello, members of the Merry Marvel Marching Society. This is Dante D bringing you all another video, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. If you're new to the channel today, welcome. Please consider subscribing if you have not already done so, and do not forget to follow the channel on Instagram and Twitter. For those of you that have seen some of my other videos, you probably have figured out by now that I have an appreciation for all things bad and crappy. That is why I wanted to do a video on the worst comic books ever published. I'm so stoked to bring this list to you today. I kind of compiled this countdown today by reading a lot of comic book blogs and literature on comic books. These books that you're going to be seeing here today are the books that are generally considered to be generally terrible by comic book fans, comic book critics, and by myself as well.
Crap, mega crap.
Marvel had a music imprint in the early 90s, and they did some comics about some groups. This one here by Billy Ray Cyrus really kind of stood out to me because I was thinking to myself, why would you make a comic book about Billy Ray Cyrus? I mean, I know he was achy breaking a lot of hearts back in the 1990s, but even before the book was printed, I could tell you that a book about Billy Ray Cyrus would just be plain lame. And that is exactly what this book was. Plain crap and just lame. Number 19, we have US number 1. Is this a book that you've even heard of? This is a book that I know a lot of people have not heard of. I've actually heard of it. I've seen it a few times in dollar bins, but I never really paid it any attention. But this book to me was Marvel's attempt to capitalize on the Smokey and the Bandit film. This is about a trucker named Ulysses S. Archer who has superpowers and drives around the country, and he has a metal head that picks up radio waves. His biggest villain in this series is a villain named the Highwayman, who just happens to be his brother and also happens to be a character who got his powers from aliens. Yeah, seriously? I wonder if this book is as lame as it sounds. This is what happens when a bunch of creators who have no idea get together and slap something together real quick to capitalize on an already popular movie. Number 18, we have another book that I feel would fall into the lame category, and that is this 1991 series called NFL Super Pro, about a superpowered football player. Seriously, you're gonna do a series about a superpowered football player? Now, the reason why I hate this book is not because I hate football. It's because comics and football are two genres that do not go together. I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I generally think that comic book fans, for the most part, hate football. And for the most part, football fans probably don't give a crap about comics. So why would you put these two together? Funny enough, for as stupid as this comic book sounds, it still ran 12 issues. I'm just going to attribute that to comic book speculation, which was at an all-time high in 1991. With this next book coming in at number 17, you're probably going to think that I'm picking on Marvel, but please just stay tuned. There are some DC book and independent books that will appear on this list. But anyway, at number 17, we have the Marvel swimsuit specials. Yes, you heard correctly. Marvel swimsuit specials, and they are exactly what you were thinking. These gems featured a bunch of Marvel characters on the beach in swimsuits that were released, I think, once a year or so. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but they were all drawn in swimsuits and in very provocative positions. You're going to do a swimsuit special on a bunch of comic book characters? Let's get real here for a second. These are comic book characters. Why are you drawing them in swimsuits, and why are you drawing them provocatively? Now, I know comic book characters are drawn provocatively all the time, especially the ladies in the universe. I'm not a fan of that either, But here, I think they're just going way too far, and the fan base of Marvel absolutely hated these. That being said, do any of you out there have these swimsuit specials buried deep in your comic collection? Please do not be embarrassed to admit it. Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Number 16, we have our first DC book, and that is Countdown to Final Crisis. This was an event that went on back in 2007, I believe, and that is when DC released an issue every single week for 52 weeks to complete this whole story. This comic book series here was critically reviled, not only by critics, but also by fans. People consider this to be a representation of everything that is wrong with the comic book industry. The story was convoluted, difficult to follow, there were too many things going on, and this is what happens when the editors are way too involved in the writing and how a story is carried out. It was just terrible. Let's not forget about my favorite panel from this series, which features Superman yelling, "I'll kill you! I'll kill you to death!" And the crisis continues with our number 15 book, which is Identity Crisis. Ooh, I'm sure I hit a few nerves there. I know there are a few people out there who like Identity Crisis. But seriously, what's with DC and all the crises out there? There's Crisis on Infinite Earths, Countdown to Crisis, Identity Crisis. I'm sure I'm going to get some hate for including this book on the list because I know there are some people out there that actually really like Identity Crisis. But the reason why I had this book on the list is because it is just plain mean. And let's not also forget about the infamous rape of Elongated Man's wife, Sue Dibney. This book came at a time when comic book publishers were experimenting a little bit and were really trying to take the darkness that was already present in comics to the next level. So they started including things like rape. And this comic book here is probably the comic book which I consider to be the book that started the whole rape epidemic in comics. And some of you might disagree. You're probably going to call me whatever, social justice warrior, whatever. But you have to admit that a lot of stories that distastefully dealt with rape followed this book here. Number 14, we have a relatively older book, which is Avengers number 200, which features the rape of Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers. Now with this book here, the sexual assault wasn't as in your face as it was in say, a book like Identity Crisis, but it was still there nonetheless. Avengers 200 is a storyline that deals with an interdimensional being that is trapped in limbo, and he somehow brainwashes Carol Danvers with his mind powers and impregnates himself into Carol Danvers in order to escape the limbo. He's then born and grows up rather quickly. What's really shocking about this story is that the Avengers don't really do anything about this being. If anything, Carol Danvers actually comes to the being's defense and says to leave the being alone because she actually has developed a love for it. Seriously, if you're the type of reader that looks at particular messages that a comic book might be trying to convey, what type of message is this book trying to get across? I think it's a little mess, and I'm not really going to get into it, but at the end of the day, I think this was a very poor way for the Avengers to celebrate their 200th issue. Number 13 is a comic book series called Nemesis, which was published by Icon, which is also an imprint of Marvel, and it kind of examines what it would be like if Batman were evil. Don't even ask me about the whole publication copyright implications here because it was a little bit of a mess. They literally marketed this book as what if Batman were evil and kind of made DC a little bit uncomfortable, but at the end of the day, this was still done. Now, the character in this book is called Nemesis, but he is very much a representation of Batman, and he's meant to be a representation of Batman if he was a complete and total asshole. Some people actually like this book, but I think at times the writers really went a little bit too far with some of the themes that they included and some of the things that happened that were included in there just purely for shock and awe. For example, the Nemesis Batman character, whatever you want to call him, artificially inseminates a woman with her brother's semen and rigs a bomb to go off if an abortion is attempted. I'm serious, I'm not making that up. That is really messed. I actually felt really gross even kind of saying that aloud. And to be honest with you, contrary to what you're probably thinking right now, I am not easily offended when I read a comic book story. But there are times when I'm reading a story and I'm like, seriously, you just put that in there for shock and awe and for cheap thrills. And then I myself feel insulted as a reader that a writer would insult my intelligence, that they're thinking that I'm not picking up on what they're doing. Number 12, we have Action Comics 592 to 593, which features Superman and Big Barda make a porno. I am not even kidding you here. Superman in Action Comics 592 and 593 was portrayed filming an adult film with this character here. And when you look at this cover, it actually is kind of funny. I was looking at this and I'm like, you gotta be kidding. DC actually did this? This book appears on this list for being really just a dumb idea and for including themes and a storyline that just really, I don't think is appropriate or even fits well in a Superman comic book.
What's the point of being the Man of Steel if you don't know how to use all that metal in it?
I can maybe see it with Batman, but definitely not with Superman. How does Superman even start off a porno scene, you know? What does he do, a little dance or something? I don't know, what do you think? Number 11, we have The Ultimates number 8, which is a book that has appeared in our videos before. I believe it was in one of our worst covers video, but here it is again, returning for being one of the worst comic books ever published. And of course, this book is infamous for portraying an incestuous relationship between Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, who are brother and sister. And if that's not enough, there's a scene in this book where Wolverine, who in this representation of the Marvel universe is it's implied that he's their father, and he actually watches them get it on. Yeah, it's a whole lot of mess. I really don't think that any characters in the Marvel universe should be going Lannister on us.
Live right here in the Red Keep with you.
Not now.
We are now in our top 10 books, with our number 10 book being The Evil Men Do. This was a limited Spider-Man series, and the reason why it's on the list is because it features the rape of Black Cat. As you can tell, I am definitely not a fan of rape in comics. I just think when it appears in comics, it is inappropriately used and portrayed. I'm not saying that rape is something that you can't do a story on. I just think that it's a sensitive subject that needs to be executed properly in order for it to not be just terrible. Our next book is a book which I'm sure you anticipated would appear on this list at some point. Well, here it is in our number 9 spot, All-Star Batman and Robin, The Boy Wonder by our buddy Frank Miller. Frank Miller, who was a comic book legend at one point and has in recent years kind of become a laughing stock. I'm sure you all know why this book is on this list. It was just absolutely hilarious, and not intentionally hilarious. It just has very poor characterization of Batman. They portray Batman as a sociopathic asshole who's very abusive to Robin. There's actually a scene where he makes Robin hunt in a cave for vermin to use as food. He just makes Batman unnecessarily act like a dickwad. And then of course, this book is also famous for that famous line, and we all know the line, I am the goddamn Batman. Like personally, when I read Batman, I hear Kevin Conroy, but I don't know if like Kevin Conroy's voice really fits here. Like, I'm the goddamn Batman. Sorry if the impression's crappy, but like this is more like a Christian Bale thing. Like, I'm the goddamn Batman. To this day, I am still laughing about that line. Now I want you to all be honest with me for the next book. If I asked you if you thought Peter Parker's Aunt May was hot and you fantasize about her, what would you tell me? Probably no, right? Well, Marvel wanted to make sure that you would be able to fantasize even about Aunt May. And that brings us to our number 8 book, Trouble. For those of you that don't know this book, at this point right now, you're probably like, Dante, what the are you talking about right now? Trouble is a story that Marvel released in the early 2000s, which featured a younger Aunt May who goes on a camping trip with Ben Parker, Richard Parker, and Mary Parker. And she is portrayed as a little bit of a Jabba the slut. Seriously, she is so slutty in this book. This whole book is all about trying to get laid and these girls trying to get laid and just everybody trying to get laid. But what ends up happening in this book is that Aunt May cheats on Uncle Ben with Richard Parker and accidentally gets knocked up by Richard Parker. So it turns out that Peter Parker is actually Aunt May's son? Seriously, talk about taking years and years of story development and story canon and just flushing it down the toilet with one story. I honestly actually even read the story because when I found out about this series, I could not believe it. So I went and I read it, and I'm telling you, skip it. It is terrible. Why? Why, Marvel, would you take sweet Aunt May and make her a trollop? And not only Aunt May, Richard Parker is a total man whore in this series. Uncle Ben and Mary Parker are a little bit more tame, but it's really Aunt May and Richard Parker who are the biggest culprits when it comes to loose virtue in this particular story. This book here is another one which I'm sure you expected to be on this list at some point. Coming in at number 7, we have the Spider-Man Clone Saga, known as the book that started off good and ended off really bad and just dragged on way too long. I could literally probably do a whole video on everything wrong with the Spider-Man Clone Saga, but even if you're new to comics, I'm sure you've heard of the Clone Saga and how terrible it was. Marvel just literally dragged this thing on too long. This story was originally supposed to be wrapped up in just a few short issues, and it ended up going on for 2 whole years. After a while, it even seemed like Marvel was just trying to keep this story going on for as long as possible, and that was due to Marvel not wanting the Spider-Man Clone Saga series to not overshadow other big events they had going on at the time, and it was just a big mess. And this storyline dragged on for so long that the plot got so confusing and convoluted, and by the end, it was just a total shit show. In our number 6 spot, we actually have 2 books, and that is Youngblood and Deathmate. What do these 2 books have in common? I'm sure you already answered that question correctly, and that is Rob Liefeld. Both these books here are known for having absolutely nonsense stories, terrible art. I think in Deathmate they have some art that has some value because Rob Liefeld wasn't doing the whole thing by himself. But Youngblood is known for its ridiculous art, ridiculous story, and Deathmate is known for its very weird story that just makes no sense whatsoever. And deadlines that were blown all the time. Rob Liefeld was notorious for not keeping deadlines. These books had inconsistent release schedules, which led to the public losing interest a little earlier than anticipated. Our next book is probably one of the most hated comic book storylines of all time, and that is the Sins Past run on Spider-Man, which lasted from Amazing Spider-Man 509 to 514. This is the story arc in which we learn that Gwen Stacy had a past relationship with Norman Osborn, who is the character that actually eventually ends up killing her. And not only that, but she also had twins by him? Yes, Gwen Stacy had twins by Norman Osborn, which means at some point they had sex. Really, that is a whole lot of wrong, and that is so messed. Not that there's anything wrong with age differences in relationships, but if you really examine the dynamic between these 2 characters and the history between these 2 characters up until the point that this book was published, it really does not make any sense at all. Of course, Sins Past was slammed both by critics and comic book fans alike, and it's not only due to the relationship that they put in this story between Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy, which was clearly just for shock value, but also the holes in the story. Just to name a few, how did Gwen Stacy hide a pregnancy from Peter Parker? How did she have twins and Peter not know about them? And how did the twins in the story grow up so fast? But aside from all that, this storyline essentially defiles the character of Gwen Stacy and is a big slap in the face to anyone who was a fan of Gwen Stacy. She's just acting so out of character, and it's just, the whole relationship is just wrong. At number 4, we have another Amazing Spider-Man story, which is probably, arguably, the most hated Amazing Spider-Man story of all time, and that is the One More Day story arc, in which Peter Parker essentially makes a deal with the legit devil to save his Aunt May, and what the devil ends up wanting from this whole deal is Peter Parker's marriage. So this story arc here essentially ends that marriage between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. I think to this day, I still have not met anybody who liked this story arc here. It is hated almost by everybody. I don't think I've read one good review about this story arc here, but you tell me, what did you think about One More Day? Have you read it? Did you like it? If you liked it, please let me know in the comments. I would really like to hear from you. At number 3, we have The Dark Knight Strikes Again by Frank Miller. If The Dark Knight Returns was an amazing book, this was a disgustingly terrible book. After writing The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller got a lot of calls from previous Batman writers and were telling him that he essentially destroyed the character that all these writers spent years building up. But you know what? I would disagree with that in The Dark Knight Returns because Frank Miller was offering something new and revolutionary and groundbreaking, and it was really, really working for Batman. This book here essentially tries to recreate that magic from The Dark Knight Returns, but it ends up being a total mess. Batman essentially goes from being a cynical loner that he was in The Dark Knight Returns to a just plain sociopathic maniac. The art in this book is bad. The writing is bad. Everyone has these giant hands. I don't know what is going on here. Do not know what Frank Miller was thinking when he was writing this book. In our number 2 spot is yet another Frank Miller book, and that is Holy Terror, which was originally meant to be a Batman book, but it evolved into something completely different to the point where Frank Miller actually had to get it published by a different company. Frank Miller was once one of the best comic book creators in his prime, but he has just fallen so far from grace. I know in recent years he's been doing some other things. He actually released The Dark Knight 3, which I haven't read yet. I have it, but I haven't read it yet. I really hope it's good. I really, really want to see some good work coming from Frank Miller again. If you read Dark Knight 3, please let me know in the comments if you liked it or you didn't like it. The character in the book is not called Batman. He's actually called the Fixer, but he is almost exactly like Batman in every which way because, again, this was meant to be a Batman book. This book kind of shows you what Batman would be like if he were a flaming racist. The Fixer essentially goes to war with terrorists after the 9/11 attacks, and the whole book is about the Fixer just shooting and killing a bunch of Muslims. Now again, I'm not one of those people that thinks that comic book creators should avoid certain topics. You want to do a book like this, fine. But this book at the end, the finished product was just corny, superficial, really, really bigoted, and didn't really offer anything new on the discourse with regards to terrorism. One good thing I can say about this book is at times Frank Miller is doing some really interesting things with the art. It is that kind of Sin City noir style art that Frank Miller loves so much. But I can't say that all of the art was totally bad. I mean, it wasn't the greatest, but there were times when it was interesting. But the art alone, I don't think really makes it worth reading. For this one, I've read it and I can say you can skip this one and you would be okay. And in our number 1 spot, we have Marvel, which is a book you might have not even heard of. But this book here is considered to be the all-time worst comic book ever published, not just by myself, but by fans and bloggers all over comic bookdom. Honestly, there was not one good thing that anybody had to say about Marvel. I've actually read a little bit of it, and there's not one good thing that I can say about Marvel either. Marvel was a book that was published in the early 2000s, and it was part of this You Decide campaign, which was a bet between Bill Gemma, I hope I'm saying that right, and a few other writers at Marvel. So 3 books were released simultaneously. Marvel, I believe it was Ultimate Adventures, and I think it was Captain Marvel or something like that. And the fans had to decide which book would survive and which books would be canceled. Clearly this one did not win. I believe it was the Captain Marvel book that actually survived, which I think was only slightly better. I could probably do a whole video about everything that is wrong with this book, but I only have a few more seconds, so I'm going to try to summarize it really quickly. First off, this book was meant to be a satire, and if you want to do a satire book, that's fine. But I think this book was really meant to be a satire on the comic book industry and make commentary about that. But only the first 2 issues were talking about that, so they were really misleading because by the 3rd issue, things completely got changed around and it was dealing more about the origins of life, and to me it was just the last issues were just about Bill Gemma getting his religious views and his views on the world across to the audience. It's just really, really bad. Marvel is really known for its sexy and over-sexualized covers, but what's funny is the people that are in these covers don't actually appear in the book, so you could tell that these covers were just designed to grab your attention and nothing else. So that about does it for our list today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Do you agree with this list? Are there any other bad comic book storylines that you feel I might have forgotten in this video? Please let me know in the comments. I would really like to know what your thoughts are on bad comic book storylines. Until next time, this is Dante D signing off. I will see you all in the next episode.